Так, все в порядке.
Сейчас. Это видно или нет?
Да, все хорошо видно.
Хорошо. Окей. У меня есть русский перевод текста, который я с удовольствием пришлю вам после этой презентации. Но сейчас это будет, к сожалению, на английском языке, мой родной. Okay, so for the last several years, I've been obsessed with a ballet called Satanilla. This obsession is very unhealthy. It has actually meant that I've had to do archival research in many cities around the world. And one of the questions that I've tried to answer for myself is why exactly this ballet matters, why exactly it matters to me, and why it actually deserves this amount of time. So I want to actually just, first of all, show you some things about it. First of all, on this first screen, this ballet, which was premiered in Paris in 1840, and then went to Spain, and then came to Russia in a choreography by Marius Petipa, was something that actually was incredibly popular in the 19th century. It was also based on a novel by Jacques Cazot that was incredibly popular, a novel that was ultimately censored, and Jacques Cazot was a writer who ended up being executed during the French Revolution. In order to actually understand this ballet and its history, I have actually had to write to a lot of people, including, as you see there, an email that I sent to Maria Shcherbakova, who is the archivist of the Mariinsky Theater Archive, to actually find out about the history of the orchestration of this ballet in Russia. I have also done work at Bolshoi Theater Archive, and I've done work in Paris. I've actually obtained materials from Madrid, as well as some things from the Harvard Theater collection. So this is these are the parts of this ballet that are at the Bolshoi Theater Archive. These are from the late 19th century. This is an image of the set of the ballet that's in Ergali in Moscow. This is also a set that was actually used in an opera. So it was used both in the opera and the ballet Satanilla. And then here is the reason why I started working on this ballet, is that the one dance that exists on this ballet, it's called the Satanilla Pas de Deux. And when you actually watch this video, which you can see everywhere, this is not actually the music that is in the ballet, nor is it the choreography that is used in the ballet. So the one surviving fragment of this ballet has both incorrect music and incorrect dance. So for that reason, I decided to try and find this work. And doing so is the story I want to tell you as to why I did so. Okay, so first of all, let me back up and actually start to read this paper. Let me start off with some general remarks about Marius Petipa. We know that Marius Petipa made Russian ballet awesome. He did so owing to his collaborations with Tchaikovsky, and also for his technical fastidiousness and the fact that he elevated male dancers into powerful virtuosos. He was himself, Petipa, a dancer, as we all know. He toured from the age of 7 with his father through Europe, but his fame rests on these choreographies that we have. He created more than 60 ballets in 60 years. He came to St. Petersburg, Russia, by way of France and Spain. He accepted a 1-year contract at the Mariinsky Theater in 1847, and then that contract was renewed, and he became the ballet master, and he stayed there until 1907, when he retired at the age of 89. He didn't want to retire. He felt he had more work to do. Petipa created 60 ballets, as I just said. These ballets have everything. They have the exotic, they have the erotic, they have the fantastic. Lovers wander through magic forests. There are pirates battling pashas. There are snowflakes that dance. Dramatic coherence in these ballets matters less a lot of times than choreographic logic and adherence to a formula that changed over time. The pas d'action conveyed important plot points, while the lead couple danced the grand pas de deux and the prima ballerina showcased her skills with bravura variations. Within the corps de ballet, abstract patterns suggested something beyond the story, or even beyond the human, with geometry a kind of portal to the divine. So Petipa not only created ballets, but he's also imagined, given his dominance, to have invented ballet itself as a kind of art, a Russian art, a grand Russian art. Petipa, as we know, served 4 different Russian czars between 1847 and 1903, and he demonstrated mind-boggling inventiveness. His first imperial ballet was Paquita, which had earlier been choreographed by a person named Joseph Mazilier. And the last work was called The Romance of the Rosebud and the Butterfly, which was a work that did not have success. And then in between, we have the great Tchaikovsky ballets, which we all know. We have Bayadere, we have Don Quixote, we have Raimonda, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He and his father created additional ballets. He and his assistant, Lev Ivanov, were responsible for a lot of this work. And he also created dances for operas. He did dances for productions of The Queen of Spades and Bizet's Carmen, among other things. So why am I telling you all of this? The reason I'm telling you all of this is that the famous ballets by Petipa survive, the other ones do not. And the question then is, why do certain ballets, why are they famous and why are they not? Why are certain ballets considered to be masterpieces and other ballets altogether disappeared? So there is a ballet by Petipa called The Magic Pills from 1886. It's crazy. It starts off in a pharmacy, then it goes to a Madrid square, then it goes to the crater of a volcano, then it goes to the bedroom of a sorcerer. There's a divertissement there called The World of Amusements, which has the dancers moving around like chessboard pieces. He had Petipa wrap one of his ballerinas in ribbons for a sensational spinning solo, and the show also included a ballet de nation, which actually represented the needlework of different lands. That work, The Magic Pills, is eclectic, it's lost, but it was in its time incredibly popular. So the question then is, what would happen if we had all of Petipa? What about The Magic Pills? What about Satanilla, or his version of it? What would change in terms of our understanding of what ballet was as an art form? My sense is that if we had all of Petipa's ballets, including the ones that have disappeared but were once incredibly popular, we would have an art form that was very messy, very chaotic, would not actually have classical logic and the strictures imposed on it, would be more of a bric-a-brac, less classical than cacophonous. We'd also have a lot of works that are a lot of fun. And the idea here is that if we recover the lost Petipa works, even as archival projects, what you actually have is an art form in which styles and genres mix together in a pretty happy mobile pastiche, which was meant to please specific audiences in specific times and places. Architectural metaphors are used to describe the so-called essence of ballet, but these in fact obscure it because the essence of ballet is motion and flux. The point seems obvious, but praising ballet's classicism with its pureness of form and aesthetic ideals of design denies the truth of ballet as bodies in motion. So to rewrite the history of ballet in a more honest, less sterile way requires researching and reconstructing dances that are decidedly non-classical, even a bit sordid, even a bit tawdry. You can call ballet divine if you want, but then the divine becomes, when you look at these works that have disappeared, God's own junkyard. So what I'm going to do here is actually talk about Satanilla, which is one of those famous ballets that in the 1890s, after 50, almost 60 years of success, disappeared from the Russian stage. It was very popular. It awkwardly juxtaposed seemingly incompatible representations. Part of this ballet is realistic, part of it is romantic, part of it is religious, part of it is supernatural. It is at heart a ballet about devils or devillettes. And so right there, we actually have a ballet that actually challenges the general stereotypical image of a dancer as angelic. This is about the opposite. And it also is a work that calls into question not only the genius of the choreographer or choreographers as creator, but also the static classical perfection of classical ballet. This is a work that offends. Satanilla was and is offensive in terms of its contents. It can be reconstructed, I guess. That is to say, in the last 3 or 4 years, with a lot of help, I've gathered together all sorts of materials that would allow for a kind of archival staging of the work with a professional group. More challenging, impossible to reconstruct, of course, is the ballet's historical milieu, both within the court of St. Petersburg in the 19th century and the canon of ballet as policed in the 21st century. Here we encounter the familiar inevitable problems of performance practice. Ballet is allographic. It's not bound to an original authored version in its very nature, and even the most rigid choreographies mutate, with choreographers drawing on diverse and often fragmentary materials while seeking always to leave their own imprint on a work. Late 19th century artists likewise embraced the allographic qualities of the art of ballet in stressing its ineffable essence, but by these measures, Satanilla is a profanation, a burlesque of both the supernatural and the divine that insists instead on the materiality of the medium. This ballet is quite literally a hot mess. Okay, so what I'm going to do is actually talk about the work. This is the scenario that was published in 1840. The original work was actually choreographed not by Petipa, but by Mazilier. The original ballet actually had 2 composers. We had a composer named Benoit, who actually did the music for the first and third acts, and Reber did the music for the second act. So right there, we have a ballet in which there are 2 composers writing the music. These days, the idea of a single work, an opera, a ballet, a symphony being composed or involving more than one composer would seem bizarre, but this was not abnormal in the 19th century. We have both of these composers, Reber and Benoit. They were employees of the Paris Conservatoire. Both of them were organ players. I do not know whether or not they talked to one another when they were writing the music for this work, but there is connections between the music of Benoit and Reber within the composition, even though the styles and the sound and the harmonic logic is quite different between the 2 of them. The scenario of this is based on the novel by the aforementioned Jacques Cazot. The scenario was actually done by this person named Honoré de Saint-Georges, who was also involved in the scenario for Giselle, so he knew what he was doing when he actually put this work together. Okay, we have in Paris various sketch designs. And what I'm going to actually do is basically tell you the story of this ballet. What you have here is a story about a nobleman who is a gambler, who is somebody who's quite unhappy in his life. He is actually somebody with a lot of girlfriends. He is somebody with terrible gambling debts, and he wants to get out of trouble. So for Russian stages, when this work came to Russia, the idea of having a nobleman who was corrupted in different ways, dissolute in his behavior, was already something that was potentially problematic for the censors. But nonetheless, this work was staged successfully in Russia. So the hero then is this cursed person named Count Frederick. He's struggling to liquidate his gambling debts. He dabbles in order to get out of trouble, out of debt, with the supernatural. And there's a kind of satiric element, satiric references to Faust throughout this work. He dabbles in the supernatural with help from an assistant. He summons the devil, and the devil appears to him in different guises. The last guise that the devil appears in is this figure here. This is a beautiful character named Satanilla, who sometimes is named Uriel, sometimes is a boy, sometimes is a girl, and sometimes is other entities. Uriel entertains the Count by actually conjuring up magically a beautiful banquet. She performs dances that are primarily Spanish. She dances a fandango, an alamanda, and a cachuca. Meanwhile, because this fellow is in terrible debt, people come demanding payment to settle his debt, and what Satanilla does, is she conjures up magically bags of gold to pay off the bills. And after she pays off the bills, suddenly the bags of gold go up in smoke. And this was a dangerous special effect on stages at this period in time. Meanwhile, we have the fact that our hero, the Count, who has just now had the devil or the devilette settle his gambling debts, is involved with various sort of romantic problems. He has a girlfriend named Phoebe, but he doesn't really love her. He has another girlfriend named Lilia, whom he does love. Phoebe and Lilia don't like each other. Phoebe arranges for Lily to be abducted by pirates and taken away. But Satanilla steps in and provides the pirates with more gold to take Phoebe captive as well, because Satanilla has fallen in love with the Count too. So in other words, what happens is both the girlfriends, Phoebe and Lily, are abducted by pirates. Okay, so that's scene 2. Girlfriends, after the debt's settled, abducted by pirates. Then in the middle of the work, our heroine is summoned to hell. This is a picture that comes from one of the boulevard theaters in Paris. This is a representation of Satanilla in an altercation with the devil, with Beelzebub. And she's showing him here the cross that she's been given by the Count as a sort of symbol of the fact that he loves her. You'll notice here that this devil character is in, dark makeup, so that's a racist caricature there. This is not the Paris Opera. This is a theater, boulevard theater called the Porte Saint-Antoine, and this is nonetheless a kind of version of the ballet that was actually popularized. All right, so once the 2 girlfriends of our Count are abducted by pirates, they end up in a slave market, and they end up in a slave market somewhere in Persia. And here we have a representation of one of the slave girls dancing in this kind of harem environment. There's also a slave market that takes place here, and so on and so forth. One of the things that always strikes me as strange about ballets is that it's no problem for characters living in France to dance Spanish dancers, and there's no problem for characters stuck in a slave market in the Middle East to dance Spanish dances or French dancers or whatever. There's no problem for peasants in a village somewhere in Germany to dance waltzes. And here there's actually no problem for harem dancers to seem happy being trapped in their plight. All right, so this is actually another image from this scene here. And then we actually have a representation of one of the Russian dancers, the wonderful Lebedev, Praskovia, in the part of Satanilla in the 1860s. All right, so we have this scene initially of a gambling salon. We have a supernatural intervention in which the debts are settled by magic gold. Then we have a scene in which 2 women who are the girlfriends of our Count are abducted and taken away by pirates. They go to this somewhere land of the Middle East. Satanilla is there. She realizes that the Count still loves Lily, that one person, and she arranges Satanilla for those girls to be released from their confinement in this sort of slave market by actually seducing the Ottoman prime minister, the vizier, through sort of erotic dances. That allows them to get released. Satanilla loves the Count. Lily loves the Count. Phoebe loves the Count. And in the end, what happens is that Satanilla realizes that she can never have the Count. She actually allows him to marry the person he should be with. She herself is sent down to hell, but because she has been good, because her love has been altruistic, she is rescued by angels and taken up to heaven. So that's the work. That's the crazy plot. When you actually look at this ballet, you have everything. We have, a banquet scene. We have pirates. We have the Middle East. We have dances from all over the world. We have supernatural special effects. We have hell. We have heaven. What we don't have is anything that makes much sense. What we do have is an entertainment that had everything for all types of audiences. If you liked special effects, you had it. If you liked pirates, you got it. If you wanted wonderful melodrama, you had it as well. So it was something that was meant to appeal to everybody. When this work came to Russia via Paris and via Madrid, it was actually performed by Petipa himself on the stage. He took the lead role. Yelena Andreyanova took the title role and made it her own, as did another great romantic prima ballerina, the Moscow dancer Yekaterina Sankovskaya. And Petipa's version was performed throughout the 1870s with this wonderful dancer, Lebedeva as Satanilla and Lev Ivanov as Count Fabio. Then it was actually performed after the 40s, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, right up to the 1890s. The last choreographer to take it after Petipa was Ivan Clustin, who revived it, and then it disappeared. It basically went up in smoke. Why did this ballet disappear? That's an interesting question, and I'll try and answer that right at the end of this discussion. It was super popular, even though it actually had, encounters with the censors. First of all, you have a heroine who's androgynous. There's a lot of sexuality in this work that had to be scraped out. You also had the problem of the fact that works of the supernatural within the Russian context were allegorically sometimes associated with the spread of tuberculosis. So the supernatural and disease were associated one together. And then you also have the fact that this is a work whose primary dancers at a certain point couldn't dance the title role because it was so complicated and couldn't even teach it to their disciples, which is part of the reason perhaps why it disappeared. All right, so this work disappears in the 1890s. We don't have it anymore unless somebody like me actually puts it back together. Can we put this work back together? Yes, we can, because of the following reasons. We have here a piece of music, which one of the conference participants, Hannah McLaughlin, actually helped me to put onto sound. This is the opening of the second act. So this is the beginning of a banquet, opening of the second scene. So this is the beginning of the banquet scene. And it sounds a little bit like Rossini here. This is the music of Reber. This is archival manuscript from Paris and goes like this. Okay, so that's pretty good, and I thank Hannah for that. We also have these parts that survived from Paris in the 1840s, and one of the great things, I noticed the previous discussion about Stalnoy Skok, there was mention of the fact that there's the what's the archive of the music parts of the Notная Biblioteka Bolshoi Theatra, right? And mentioned the fact that Stalnoy Skok, some parts survive. We actually have a lot of the parts of the original version of Satanilla that survive, and because people who play percussion and people who play triangle have a lot of time where they don't have anything to do and they sit in the orchestra pit, we actually have the triangle player here actually deciding to actually draw a picture of one of the guards that is featured within the work, and then a little devil there. So had some fun with this very tiny triangle part or music part that otherwise exists. All right. The problem with this, looking at the manuscripts that exist from Paris, is that they're a mess. And when you look at the, not conductor score, but the score from which the parts were generated, you see there's an awful lot of mistakes in the notation. So when I actually was busy trying to transcribe the Tarantella, which was one of the dances that's actually performed in the Harov scene in Isfahan, somewhere in the Middle East, I just noticed that there was endless problems in terms of notation, spelling mistakes, orthography issues, and other sort of challenges associated with the voice leading that actually make the music, even when you transcribe it from the orchestral parts and the manuscript preserved in Paris, sound pretty terrible. So here, for example, is a Tarantella music. This is put, obviously on Sibelius here. And this is the sound of a dance that Satanilla herself performed in the harem scene. And it does sound a little wonky, but I'll show you what it's supposed to sound like, if it actually performed properly without this sort of software. So here's this. That's kind of the best you can do from the score, but I think that the model for this particular Tarantella comes from Napoli, which goes like this. So my point is that if we were to actually fix these notation, perform it with a good orchestra at the right tempo, it would probably sound something like this. You have to add these hand claps in and so on and so forth to actually give it this sort of, Spanish flavor. Okay. All right. So why we can reconstruct this ballet is not only because we have music, which we could correct, but we also have all of the ballet notated by a person named Henri Justement. Henri Justement was a choreographer himself, as well as a notation expert who was actually based in the city of Nice in France and worked as well in Paris, a very distinguished transcriber of ballet notation. And here you actually see the entire ballet of Satanilla written out with descriptions of various scenes. So right at the beginning here, you actually have girl dancers and boy dancers. Notice they all look like ballerinas with tutus on, but the difference is that you have black versus red. That actually distinguishes the genders here. You actually have descriptions of what's going on. You actually have drawings of the spacing on the stage. You actually have the indication of where the music is, 15 measures for this section of it and so forth. And here you actually have a sword fight that takes place right at the beginning of the work, in which the count has a conflict with another person at the gambling table before Satanilla's appearance. And here is a transcription of this. One interesting detail about Henri Justement, in notating the original choreography or his memory of it, is that he had terrible French. He writes down French with all sorts of spelling mistakes. And this is basically because he just didn't have that kind of, education, I suppose, in proper France. But you actually see here a fundamental description of everything that's going on in the sword fight scene within this work, and you can work it all out. There's also descriptions of the dances, obviously those pictures, as well as indications of where the music falls. Here is another scene. This is actually the music of the Tarantella that I actually just gave you a sample of. This is the Pas de Séduction, which is a complex of various Spanish dancers which are stuck in the Middle East. And one of the curiosities of ballet is, why do you have this scene in the Middle East, Persia, and then all the dances are Spanish? It has to do with the fact that the Spanish was exotic. It has to do with the fact that Spain was a Muslim empire for many centuries. And so transporting and moving these things around was no problem. Here you actually have a male and a female dancer. And here, this person on the mat is the Ottoman vizier, the sort of prime minister. So he represents the exotic here. And here you have Satanilla doing an anglais, which is part of her suite of seduction dances before getting to the actual tarantella and actually performing and entertaining this fellow on the mat. And all of this actually, has this kind of description here in which you have the dancer dancing seductively at this period in times, unveils her right calf, etc. The vizier notices again, he scratches his nose, etc., etc., etc. All of these kind of, and you actually have the actual specific motions, the cat step to the side, etc., for actually representation of the seductive here. And here is the final scene of the ballet in the notation, in which you have Satanilla has failed in her essential mission, which is to actually take the soul of the count and have it taken to hell. She has fallen in love with him instead. So she's condemned herself. She returns to the inferno. Beelzebub condemns her. But because of her love, because of her selfish deeds, because all of the help that she gave to the other characters in the story, she is actually taken up to heaven. And here you have the beautiful scene right at the end in which the angel comes down. There is Satanilla there. There are the characters of the inferno, and she is taken up to heaven right at the end of this work. So it's a very beautiful conclusion of it. All right. So a few years ago, when Petipa was having celebrations of his career, bicentennial celebrations, I was in St. Petersburg, Russia, and I attended a cultural forum. And this was dedicated to Petipa, among other things. There was a closing gala concert at the Mariinsky Theater. The Minister of Culture at that period in time, Vladimir Medinsky, was there. The President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, was there. And they gave speeches. And they talked about the fact that Russia has had a tremendous contribution to the arts across the planet. Obviously in ballet, obviously in literature and everything. And Putin and Medinsky both talked about the fact that Russia was committed to preserving tradition. They were committed to preserving the classics. And Petit Pas was described, as an image of pure grace in terms of his contribution to ballet. And in keeping with a long-standing tradition of actually, representing artists as, on a sort of celestial plane, the focus in the Petit Pas celebrations was primarily on his choreographies, nothing to do with his personal life, nothing to do with the non-Russian sources of his inspiration, how he retired, his finances, and so forth. And what was extolled were the great Petit Pas ballets, the Tchaikovsky ballets, first and foremost. This one, Satanilla, which is a ballet that he adapted, he re-choreographed, he danced in, and he kept on the stage for 30 or 40 years of his career, was not talked about. And this is a work that has a strange history in Russia because it comes and goes off of the stage of the Bolshoi and the Mariinsky. It's also something that actually was very messy, changed because audiences in Moscow were not the same as audiences in St. Petersburg, and has different manifestations. What was it like? We actually have this description of how it goes. This is the ballerina from Moscow, Ekaterina Sankovskaya. She wrote a couple of letters to a student of hers right at the end of her career, Maria Manukhina, and actually talks about how to dance the role of Satanilla on stage. And so you see there in Russian and English, she's talking about the scene in which she's holding on stage the contract for the Count's soul. Begin to weep when you hear the cue, not before. And after 4 measures, let go, Count's hands. Go to light the paper, the contract that sells Fabio's soul to the devil. The second time, not with your back to the table, just turn your head to Kuznetsov. The dancer opposite her tossed the paper at the tremolo, pointed at the cue, and say that you're going to die, but do so quietly and weakly. Yesterday, the paper burned properly. If it burns too slowly in your hand, wave it down, and if too quickly, raise it, and so forth. So these are specific stage instructions which Sankovskaya is giving to her disciple. And actually, she says at the end, make sure that you thank the conductor after the performance is over. He's not a very good conductor, but still thank him nonetheless because he's holding the show together. God be with you, and so forth. It's a beautiful letter. This is preserved at the Bakrushin Museum in Moscow. She's talking about cues. She's talking about actual performance of this work. And this letter preserves an essential truth about ballet. Dances endure or they disappear, not necessarily owing to their abstract worth as measured by the genius of their creators, but instead thanks to the embodied experiences of their dancers. Satanilla survived as long as there were dancers who were interested in the title role and interested in actually teaching their students that title role. The ballet received great reviews at the start in Russia, and then it was popular enough to maintain a presence in the repertoire until the end of the 19th century, but it was not popular enough in the imperial theaters to be considered indispensable. Budgets, money plays a role here. Production records from as early as 1859 focus on performing the ballet, which is a ballet that involves all sorts of things and travels around on a shoestring budget with the aim of keeping costs down. Moreover, part of the reason why Satanilla disappeared is that taste changed. French and Spanish romantic ballets trafficked in tales of the supernatural, in part because French grand operas privileged historical subjects. So the horror, the demons, and the supernatural were to be found in the feats of dancers. Plots were enacted in pantomime, a practice that lost favor as physicality and purity won out. Satanilla makes no sense without the pantomime, without the acting, without the story. And it did not until the apotheosis privilege dance as dance. Only at the end of this work do you have this sort of ballet blanc pure dance scene. Audiences at the turn of the 20th century started favoring conservative ballets with distinguished performance histories. Satanilla was not conservative. This is a work that has very fluid gender relationships, crosses sexual boundaries very explicitly. It's based on a novel that was censored as quasi-pornographic. And this work also had come and gone in its own time. Most of Petit Pas' ballets disappeared when their star performances put them aside. Such, I think, would have been the case with Swan Lake when ballerina Pierre Legnani retired in 1901. But by 1901, the linkage of particular ballerinas to particular ballets was rapidly breaking down. Swan Lake survived because of its merits and because it had become popular with audiences aside from the presence of a certain dancer. The classical work concept of the ballet might thus be said to be a modern invention. The last thing I want to say here is that context matters. What gave life to Satanilla in its time was a folksy, mazurka-filled entertainment with a plot of laughter and tears and a raw, sensuous directness. Satanilla reveals the truth of the vernacular. Its enduring appeal resided until it didn't in its changing performance. Its appeal relied not on architecture, but on the allographic as opposed to autographic element. It relied on the bodies and the roles, their individual techniques and signature moved. When those bodies disappeared, so too did the ballet. Dance, like music, confounds us with its flow. It's ethereally moving, shifting, ever-changing perceptual surfaces. What a colleague of mine has called the paradox of the ineffable. Asserting instead that the art traffics in essences is to claim that it's somehow independent of the mind, of peoples, and of bodies. And that is a strange thing to say about something so wholly embodied. 2 paragraphs left. So to search for Satanilla is to remember, to reimagine ballet as an art of destruction and adaptation and recreation. These are the powers claimed by Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust, an obvious inspiration for Satanilla. This seemingly tawdry bricolage of romantic tropes and musical miscellany forces us to value the process of art rather than the product. Satanilla, in all of its messy wonder, remains always in motion and thus a formless form, an ideal one. That's one way to end this little talk from the archival crypt. Another is to quote a very wonderful former ballerina named Toni Bentley. She believes that ballet, if you were actually to describe what ballet is in a single sentence, she'd say it's the body divined. The body divined. That's a paradox. It captures not only Bentley's own experience on stage as a Balanchine dancer, but also the very complexity of ballet as an art that is all too human. The body divine means something that is made divine, or divinized, or understood at last, the way we divine an oracle. The beauty of the justement notation, the beauty of Tchaikovsky's recollection, the beauty of this messy music reminds us that context and essence are ever entwined, and that the divine can be human and the human can be divine. Okay, we'll pause it there. Thank you.
Огромное спасибо. Очень интересно. Будут ли вопросы, комментарии?
I have a question. When do you think this will be staged?
Okay, so let me talk about that. This is a long ballet, so it's like Sleeping Beauty long. People in the 19th century had more patience than people today. When we go to opera ballet, 2 hours is lots. This is 3.5. It involves a lot of set changes, very expensive. To stage this these days would cost, well, for a professional company in New York, say, or Paris or Moscow would be, around $1 million. But I have actually talked with Alexei Rapansky about this project. I sent him that beautiful justement notation. And he knows justement notation because of his own productions of Giselle, which is notated and preserved by justement as well. He's interested in doing it, as well as a choreographer with Pacific Northwest Ballet called Phil Chen. And what we're going to do is probably apply for funding from NEA, organization in the United States, or private funding to at least stage probably, the scene in the exotic scene taking place in the harem, or one of the other spectacular scenes. So probably try and build it up from there. My my problem with reconstruction of ballets is that, what does it mean to reconstruct a work that actually was performed before electricity was used in theaters? Do you use batteries? Do you use occasional bits and pieces of electricity? At what level does the reconstruction stop? What do you do about the fact that there was enormous stretches of this ballet that were gesture and pantomime and storytelling? So ultimately, it's the kind of project that, although I think Pacific Northwest will do part of it, or maybe all of it. It's the kind of project that is really a historical exercise that is good for sort of college and university campuses. But I'm working on it, and there are a lot of people, because it's so strange, and because actually it's so politically incorrect, and because it's petit pas, and because the music is pretty good, because we have the notation of the choreography, it's of a great deal of interest to historical types. John?
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for your talk. This is the first time hearing you talk, so it's wonderful. I had two questions, if that's acceptable. The first was, you mentioned at the end the difficulty of the choreography. And I was curious, I think you had alluded to this, but the role of the difficulty in the ballet's disappearance. So I'm curious how this has, if this had lasting influence on kind of the aesthetic choices of choreographers, where they would make choreography purposefully stationary, or maybe based on shapes, in order to make the longevity of the opera of the ballet easier. From choreographer to choreographer, house to house, even looking at Swan Lake, most of its shapes rather than kind of sporadic movement.
Mm-hmm. So that's one question, or is there another one? Or
yeah, that's the first one. The second one was, you mentioned fun at the beginning, and I was just curious about that, because I would consider more of the pure conservative ballet fun. I would consider that fun, but I wouldn't even consider fun to be the purpose of ballet. Being someone who trained in ballet, I don't really view the art form that way, as something to have fun, conventionally speaking. So I just thought that usage of the word was interesting. If you could just kind of expand upon it.
Yeah, I will go to my grave actually defending the idea that if a lot of the ballets that have disappeared were the ones that were craziest and the most fun, in the sense of just being just bizarrely and fabulously irrational. If you've seen the movie The Thief of Baghdad, Baghdad is not a city that's located on the ocean, right? But if you see that movie, you go sailing away on beautiful galleons into the ocean, because why not? And these works really played in fascinating ways with conventions, and just like allowing the fantastic to just be on the edge and beyond of something that's absurd, and just a space for the ultimate freedom of representation and challenging in all sorts of different ways. So in this case, we have a ballet that was deliberately staged because the source novella was so provocative, was censored because the author ended up, he was a political rebel, and was, he used the French Revolution was considered by him to be satanic forces. And so he created this novel allegorically about it. But then the novel was also prohibited from being reprinted, owing to the fact that it had pornographic episodes in it. And so when this was put on stage in Paris, people there went to it and they said, oh, it's incredibly long, it's all over the place, it's wild. But all of these people actually came to watch the ballet in order to steal stuff from it for other shows, because it was this grand spectacle that had all of this. So people would show up and want to steal Mazilier's choreography and these certain steps and certain dances. Then when it goes to Madrid, part of it is censored because of the eroticism. So it had this kind of on the edge, kind of dangerous element to it, while also being, fabulously madcap. And one of the things, if you're conservative and you look at ballet, you can say, well, wait a minute, why is it that peasants in a village somewhere in the middle of Germany, how can they dance a waltz? They wouldn't dance a waltz. A waltz is an aristocratic ballroom genre, But ballet kind of allows that kind of absurdity, I think. And that's actually something that, rather than being critiqued, for its illogicity, I think needs to be celebrated. When I have talked to people like Alistair Macaulay about ballets by Petipa, like The Magic Pills, which disappeared, he thinks, thank God that disappeared. That sounds so terrible, right? It's so trashy, it's so crazy. And my response to that is actually, well, I'm interested in that. I'm interested in things that, were embarrassing, or people, just, went to see because it was just so bizarre. So, I guess that's part of the fun thing. And the fun also is the fact that when you had this ballet, when it came to Moscow and the Bolshoi Theater, we had this brilliant, ingenious machinist working for the theater who actually loved the idea that he could actually take this work and actually generate all sorts of special effects with fire and smoke and so forth on stage, just to have a good time, right? So this was part of it as well. The fun element also of the art has to do with the fact that some of its origins in the French, Italian, and Moscow context particularly, were out of vaudeville. And a lot of ballet over the course of time lost its vaudevillian element, its burlesque element, the idea that part of the show can be improv theater. And this had that quality to it, and I think that's also disappeared. Now, with regard to something like the fact that the title role of Satanilla was incredibly taxing. Yeah, it's actually a long night at the office for a ballerina. And part of the reason why it disappeared is there was just nobody able or willing to dance it anymore. With the case of Swan Lake, part of its fame has to do with the fact that we have Legnani coming in and actually adding those fouetté variations and actually making it a kind of spectacular virtuosic display in the third act. But if you actually compare Swan Lake to Satanilla, why did Satanilla disappear? Why did Swan Lake survive? Clearly, the title role of Swan Lake, Adet Adil, is very difficult, especially if it's one dancer doing both parts. So what is it about that work that actually kept it on the stage and meant that something like Satanilla disappeared? Is Swan Lake cheaper to stage? Yes. Is it a better story than Satanilla? It's slightly more coherent, but not much. But there was enough about Swan Lake in the turn of the 20th century where people actually, in terms of the content and the ideas and concepts it seems to be articulating, that people actually stuck with it and kept it on the stage, even if there weren't dancers that could do what Legnani did. So there's a certain turn that takes place in the early 20th century in which ballets begin to be looked at, not simply as star vehicles, but actually begin to look at as a sort of cohesive articulation of ideas. And that is an interesting moment. And I don't exactly know when that starts, but it's something to do with the early 20th century. And that meant that these kind of vaudevillian shows disappeared. We have, for example, Don Quixote, which is Don Q, which is a canonic ballet. There were, Petipa did 2 versions of that work. The Moscow version was fun, vaudevillian, improv theater. And then the version 3 years later for St. Petersburg and the Mariinsky was classical, more French style. That's the one that survived. That's the one that was actually given the coherence versus the idea of just let's have a bric-a-brac entertainment where people can actually throw in different types of Spanish dances. Something about the work concept and coherence actually began to govern this art form. That's, I guess, my answer. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
More questions? Еще вопросы? Спасибо огромное всем докладчикам сегодняшним, посвященное балету. Мы завершаем. Спасибо большое за внимание.
Спасибо.